Hey Tony, it's good to have you back. Last time we were on this call, we went over, the whole process of how our economy got affected with COVID-19, and I got a lot of good feedback from people. They really liked how you broke it down. And today I want to go over what I love a lot, which is real estate, but more importantly, property rights. And I recall you were mentioning a good story of the Andes of Peru that really exemplifies the importance of property rights. But before that, I'd like to go into John Locke, which is really important, if you can kind of explain that.
Okay. Yeah. So thanks for having me back on. I'm glad to know that people enjoyed what I talked about.
Oh, definitely.
And when I talk about John Locke, ultimately I have to talk a little bit about the Age of Reason or the Enlightenment. And these are things that I feel like most students, when they leave high school, it doesn't stick. So it's good that people review these things and, of course, look these people up for themselves. But if you don't mind, I like talking a little bit about, remember, the Age of Reason or the Enlightenment, which is a movement of intellectual thought that comes in the 1500s, mid 1500s, and then ends with some of the more prominent revolutions, including the American Revolution in the late 1700s. But it's questioning of authority and power. So that comes with, the new discoveries, the discovery of the New World, scientific breakthroughs in vaccinations and all kinds of stuff, right? European intellectual thought is questioning the world in which they had lived for hundreds and hundreds of years. So John Locke is one of two major English thinkers of the time that are important to understand, and they have two varying views of the world and power and authority, right? So Thomas Hobbes is a little bit older, but they're both contemporaries. They both knew each other, and well, not knew each other, but they both had studied at Oxford University. Thomas Hobbes and John Locke lived through something called the English Civil War. So rather than going through I recommend you guys look through it, but it's basically a battle over how should government be structured, right? Because the English government has this long tradition of sharing power with Parliament, which is like the equivalent of Congress to the United States of America, right? That's where we get this tradition from of a bicameral legislature, right? Where you have a Senate and a House of Representatives, and Congress and Parliament. It's a little bit different, but it's basically the same idea. Anyways, this Civil War really just kind of it showed a lot of people the destruction of war and everything like that, and it impacts the way people think. So Thomas Hobbes sees society, well, the human nature is more pessimistic, in the sense that he thinks that man is more selfish and how do I say? Naturally selfish and evil. Yeah. So inherently evil. And famously, I'll just throw a quote in here from his book. It was called The Leviathan, his most famous work. And this is where he says that without a strong government, you would need life would be, quote, solitary, poor, nasty, and brutish. In other words, really kind of, well, actually, I just quoted that wrong. Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In other words, horrible, which is kind of most of life back then anyways. But still, he believed that you needed a powerful authority figure to regulate life. So this idea of a social contract is really important. He thinks that the social contract for Thomas Hobbes is this where you give up some of your freedoms in order to have a government provide law and order, right?
So safety.
So yeah, it's the idea. A lot more for most people, it's like safety, right? Everybody wants to live in safety. So Thomas Hobbes thinks that the most effective form of government is an absolute monarchy. And absolute monarchies were really powerful in the 1600s because by that time, France, Spain, Great Britain, England, in particular, because they kind of ran the show. They had amassed a great amount of wealth, right, through their colonial findings. So anyways, everything that the king said, people had to go through with, had to deal with that, right? It's whatever the king wanted. But
and
in
not
British,
much questioning, right? As well.
and no questioning of government, right? No questioning or very little. The English case is very different because in England, they had this tradition of sharing power with Parliament, which is why the Civil War kind of breaks out, and that's why Thomas Hobbes is ultimately is inspired to write the Leviathan and analyze things from that point of view. Now, John Locke is a little bit different. Sorry for the interruptions. I don't have.
No, it's cool. It's cool.
John Locke is different in that he sees human nature as being improvable. You can improve upon your life through experience and human experience, right? So John Locke, he also sees something politically happen that is not as impactful to Thomas Hobbes. I think because Thomas Hobbes doesn't live that long to see it through. But he sees something called the Glorious Revolution, where John Locke sees the institution of what we call a constitutional monarchy, which is the idea that, England had already been going through centuries of back and forth of sharing, who shares power with whom, and that's what the English Civil War. But the constitutional monarchy, as we know it today, is set in stone during the Glorious Revolution. So John Locke sees a relatively bloodless revolution take place where the king and queen, the new ones, William of Orange and Mary II, take the throne and formally share power with Parliament to a new extent. So there's a Bill of Rights that's written up.
Wow.
The idea of cabinets. So cabinets are, even in our legislature, what they do is they analyze law, they figure out how it applies to the law, and they share it, right? So anyways, John Locke is a more positive view on human society. He thinks, he says, he believes in natural rights. And this is really important because these natural rights.
Yeah.
What's that?
This is big deal, what you're about to say. No, go on. Sorry.
Yeah, it's huge because he believes that human rights preceded government, right? So government is how we organize essentially our society. And he thinks that you have these inherent rights that are not given to you by government, but you already have them. They're given to you by a creator or, God.
And for that reason, government should always protect those rights without even questioning it. Just always.
The government inherently gets its power from the people, not the other way around.
Yeah.
So he argued three in particular: life, liberty, and property were the three. We would think of them as assets today, but he said that essentially government had to protect those rights, and if government did not protect those rights, the people who give government its power can overthrow that government and change it how they want it to work, right? Yeah. But so Thomas Hobbes and John Locke both believe in the social contract, but the social contract for John Locke is that if the government doesn't protect, that we give over responsibility to the government, we give government its power, but that if government doesn't do its job, those people in charge, then we can overthrow and change it.
And that's what influenced our country.
That's going to be in the all the founding fathers were some more than others, but in particular Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, who is the main drafter of the Declaration of Independence, is going to take John Locke's ideas and he's going to mold them. So everybody, you can look it up. Anybody who wants to look up the Declaration of Independence. Remember, the Declaration of Independence is just it's a document stating we're no longer going to be a part of. Your government has not represented us the way it should, and we therefore can. So he says this: we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, but instead of property, he says the pursuit of happiness, right? That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form, also that part of the consent of the governed shows you that influence from John Locke, the idea that power gets its power from us, from the people.
Got it. Got
right?
it. Wow, that's an incredible piece.
And that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness.
Wow, that's powerful, because that's also how we essentially, vote people in to always protect those rights as well.
Yeah,
So
we're a republic, and we're a representative democracy. So we ultimately
people forget
vote
that we're a republic.
Yeah.
In the end,
vote for people that ultimately make decisions on our behalf, based on our values and ideas and
exactly.
history, right? So,
and besides the Declaration of Independence, John Locke's way of thinking with Thomas Jefferson, he includes some of that language also with our founding fathers in the U.S. Constitution, right? With the Fifth Amendment, it says, government can't deprive you of life, liberty, and property without due process. And then on top of that, if the government ever takes a citizen's property, they must be compensated with eminent domain. So because of those inalienable rights, in the end, government is always going to be there to protect our rights with those three things at least. So I think that's very powerful with John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, and that's why owning real estate is so important in this country. And we can even get into it more specifics on why it's so important with that story you told me about Peru. Maybe you should get into that one.
Yeah, for sure. For your readers, if they ever want to read as historians, we ultimately get our information from the primary sources. Like investigators, we have to look for the evidence, right? So if your readers ever want to look at the primary sources, they want to look at Thomas Hobbes. He wrote a book called Leviathan. I think I mentioned that already.
Yeah. Say it again. How do you pronounce it? Leviathan?
Leviathan. Yeah, Leviathan is an ancient it's like a monster. It's a giant, I think a sea monster.
Yeah.
So like an absolute monarch, and a Leviathan controls everything. Has its, it's a powerful sea monster, so it can do and impose whatever it wants. So this is very in line with like Machiavelli. If you read Machiavelli's The Prince, which a lot of people will have to, in high school I only give the kids excerpts of The Prince.
I read
but
it.
It's very much like that too. Machiavelli was he basically said, do what you need to maintain control and power, even if it means doing something unethical.
And a lot of it was deception, right? From what I recall in the reading, like all these skills and deception.
It could be deception. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So that's guys. So anyways, and then if you want to look at John Locke's works, the most famous, the ones that we kind of just talked about, will be it's called the Two Treatises of Government, or Two Treatises of Government. And so when you say a treatise, it's kind of like saying not battle, but basically a discourse between two ideas, right? So he talks about that in length in the book. But anyways, you were mentioning, what did you? Sorry, we were talking about
the story of Eusebio in the Andes of Peru, and how his story with his father and grandparent, how that kind of exemplifies the importance of real estate, owning real estate.
Yeah.
Right.
So this is I haven't shown it in a while because I've been teaching government mainly, but I used to show it in my economics courses when I used to teach economics, and it's this goes in line with idea of property rights and owning assets and the tools for creating one's own life, right? And this is where government and economics kind of line up. This is why when you think about it, going back to your high school days, when you took you took one semester of economics and one semester of government. It's not enough to really make a huge impact and teach you everything about these important ideas. But the story basically is about this man. It's a great story ultimately about this guy named Eusebio, and he lives at the foot of the Andes Mountains, where people have been living there for centuries. Most people are illiterate. Most people are rural farmers. And he tells the story of how his grandfather was one day visited by somebody in the city who just showed up with a title and said, I own this land, right? So the guy shows up. He says, if you want to live on this land, you have to work for me. So it becomes almost like, medieval serfdom, or you have to work for that, and then that's you. If you live on the land, you have to provide. You take the food and you give it to the guy, and then he gives you a compensation. And then, but things happen, right? So Eusebio grows up this way. His father eventually takes over the maintenance of the land, and he starts crying at one point because he talks about how he's walking. He would have to sometimes take the livestock up the hill, sheep, whatever, and they would sometimes get eaten by wolves or foxes or mountain lions. No, he says mountain lions. Mountain lions and zorros, so foxes as well. So that would get deducted from his pain. You could see the sadness from this man.
And just really quick, I want everyone that's watching to know that I'm going to include the link of this video of the story on this video as well in the description. So if you guys want to see it for yourselves, you guys can watch it. I think it's only 11 minutes, so it's really short.
It's not that long.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So Eusebio, he kind of lives this way for a long time, and then eventually the government kicks that guy off the land in an effort to collectivize everything, right? So they create government bureaucrats. They send them over, and they put basically on a collective farm essentially, and this is the thing that happens, right? Government steps in. They think they can solve everything, and they basically just replace what the other guy was doing and making it even worse. So these government bureaucrats would get paid all this money, and then the people would remain in poverty and get like 50 cents a day or something like that.
And the way they did it in the government when they took over and collectivized everything, I think it was they put it into co-ops, right? And then these bureaucrats in government were running it, and they basically told all the farmers, okay, you can stay on the land as long as you continue working, through agriculture, and you're going to get paid, very small amount of money. At the end of the day, you're not going to have property rights though, right?
Yeah, I don't. It's a little bit different, and then they don't tell them, you have to work. If you're going to stay on this land, you gotta, it's basically the idea is that everybody benefits from everything.
There's the deception.
But the government ultimately makes the rules, and then they change things to benefit. So he talks about how these guys would go and go have nice drinks. They have their cars, they have their nice lifestyle, and he still didn't own the land. Ultimately, the government owned the land.
Yeah.
So a co-op or a collective is basically the same idea. Okay. We saw this happen, and we see this happen in Cuba. We see this happen in China. We see this in Russia, Venezuela today.
Yeah.
And so that goes on for a long time until it's unsustainable. And then now today, fast forward today, this is the bright side of the story. There's people in this organization, I forgot, it's called the
Institute of Liberty and Democracy.
Liberty and Democracy. And the guy who speaks on behalf of this organization is a guy named Hernando de Soto, and he reveals what's really important statistically about the world. The poorest countries in the world today also have the least amount of property rights, individual property rights. Okay, so we're talking, let me give you two really important examples, because we also think about when I as an educator, you always hear about Finland. Finland's got it's got the number one education year after year. it also has, ding, the number one amount of property rights as well, individual property rights.
Wow. Okay.
One of the poorest countries in the world, it's in our Haiti. The island of Haiti is got, if it's like 130 some countries, Haiti is like 128 in terms of, so it continues to be. So
worse and worse.
The government can step in and you know, if you try to set up your little shop here, the government will just come in and they just whack it down and that's it. You know, it's
yeah. And that's why the whole individualism versus collectivism, it kind of shows that individualism is much better, and a lot of that, you know, pertains to the right, you know, to property, and then the right of identification, I believe, is with this the person who runs the Institute of Liberty and Democracy, right? But doesn't he also say 2/3 of the world, to add on to what you were saying, 2/3 of the world's population doesn't have property rights or something along those lines?
Well, yeah, two-thirds of the world. So we have 6 billion people in the world. 2/3 of that, 4 billion or so, have no way to legally identify themselves to the government. They don't have individual property right. They don't know. They can't attain it. They have no way of legal way of attaining it. So he makes the point that the capitalism in particular is a game, and in order to play this game, you need assets. You need to be able to make individual decisions about property, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not so much that the government has to hand out everything, but that the government needs to define things that make it playable for everybody. So in this story, which I think is ultimately a feel good story, is that he gets those rights finally. You know, this institute, Eusebio finally, you know, gets his property rights and is legally recognized by the government as the property owner, and can now do whatever he wants with that property. And think about it, even on our level, what can you do with, you have something to be able to take loans out for your education. Yep. You can improve your property. You could take out loans to, let's say, improve the quality of your land or your building structure. Yep. And all it does is it just adds value, because anybody, for instance, who owns a home today knows that if you are going to refinance your home, you're going to sell your home, you're going to do whatever. If you, let's say, add a pool to your home, you just bumped up the value of your home, right?
And so now Eusebio has these rights to improve his land, improve his income, help his children, himself. Yeah.
And this is the thing, the government doesn't need to tell Eusebio what to do the rest of his life. They just have to say, you know what, you have legal right to this land, now do what you want with it, right? And he'll make the best decisions for himself and for his family.
Exactly. And just because Eusebio has these rights doesn't obviously mean he's going to have all the success, but at the end of the day, he has dignity in making his own decisions. And he can either do really well or fail, but at the end of the day, it's based off of, you know, his actions versus government, which more than likely he was going to already be in a bad place regardless, like he basically was from the get-go. And I think the reason why Eusebio was even in this position, it was because in Peru, especially for this little town that Eusebio and his family grew up, they never had property rights to begin with. And so that's why the government was able to do all this, right?
Yeah. They have to ultimately, and this just kind of goes back to the Declaration of Independence and John Locke, is not so much that the government has to give him everything, but again, set the framework up for his own individual success and, quote unquote, the pursuit of happiness. In order for him to pursue his happiness, you also need economic playing chips in this game of capitalism, right? So and we saw two different, we could see how both systems can be corrupted, right? You had this guy who came in from nowhere, didn't have any, you know, as far as I know, had no direct connection to the land, but he went to the government because maybe he was literate and knew he can scam the system a little bit. So he went and took advantage of that. And then you had the government come in and try to answer the things with their formula, and they messed it up even more. And then all the government, you know, and then there had to be there had to be changes made for him to be able to pursue his own success, right?
Got it. Yeah.
Um,
And then this happened the same thing in, in Cuba too, right? With Fidel Castro.
yeah, a lot of the same type of thing. And this is the problem that Hernando de Soto sees that, ultimately has led to revolutions in different parts of the world. In Russia, the first major communist revolution, you had you don't have a very big middle class in Russia. When that happens, you have very rich and very poor. Think about it.
Yeah.
Even, our families come from Mexico, and that's something you see if you go to Mexico. You don't tend to see a huge middle class. You see very wealthy and very poor, right? And that needs to shrink over, not overnight, but over time. Societies need to give the tools like property rights to people so that that middle class grows. Because if the class doesn't grow, then you're always going to have poor people looking from the outside of what's going on, and that creates anger and breeds all kinds of things, as we've seen multiple times. Cuba was a similar situation. You had a government that was corrupt, backed up in many ways. Yeah, and then you had a large rural class of people that were often illiterate and on the outskirts of society. And then you have somebody like Fidel Castro, who is an educated person, who's motivated by lots of different things, including Marxist ideas that you need a revolutionary to make change happen. But once he takes power, he distributes land. He starts to take private property and nationalize it.
Terrible. Yep.
But then what ends up happening is that ends up becoming, they become party favors to an extent. He gives them to people who he knows. He gives them to his own family. He gives them to, and what do you have? You have one of the largest mass exoduses from the island of Cuba. People literally swam through shark-infested waters in order to get away. That's why Cubans today in places like Florida can't stand Fidel Castro. I show this when I'm teaching about the Cuban Revolution, and I finally get to Fidel Castro, when he died very recently. You see the reaction in Cuba. I show him a picture of people, and then you show a picture of people in Florida celebrating.
Yeah.
And, this guy, one of the powerful things is this guy with the shirt, and it says, Fidel, tu día ha llegado. Your day has come. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's like, in other words, you're gone, man. And you never were good. So I think this is why books like George Orwell's Animal Farm is something a lot of people are looking at that book again, because that's the same type of story, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's an easy read, but you get the idea when you kind of look at these revolutions, like the Cuban Revolution in particular.
Correct. And that's why in this country, in the United States, we're so lucky to have that framework in our government, all those foundations set up for us, that if we take the proper measures and prepare, we can own land ourselves and, build that wealth and all these, advantages that come with it by owning real estate and whatnot. So I think that was a really good story that you just mentioned about Eusebio, and then the comparisons from individualism to collectivism. I think that's pretty important for people to really know, and maybe read books like Animal Farm to kind of get a better idea. If they don't want to read history, they can read this fictional book.
Yeah, he says, I don't know if it's I look at a lot of different people and ideas and read a lot of things, but capitalism is not a silver bullet, is what I think he says in the video, Hernando de Soto, which is, you have to still, capitalism is the game, but you need to create the framework, the rule. The game has to have rules. The game has to have a framework for people to be able to play,
Yeah, chance to succeed.
And property is that one of those important things for people to be able to improve their own lives, not for the government to necessarily answer everything for them,
Mm-hmm.
And even in capitalism, you can get a lot of not necessarily that people can amass lots and lots of wealth that other people might say this is obscene wealth, right? But rather, if people are, for instance, like crony capitalism, where the government, somebody like, let's say Mark Zuckerberg, right? If Mark Zuckerberg wants something passed regarding social media and he pushes for it at the congressional level and they make a law, well,
Yeah.
you forget that Mark Zuckerberg is a multi-billionaire, and startup companies that might want to start their own type of Facebook, they might get swept out of the competition right away anyways, because he's using the government in order to get what he wants.
Correct.
So there could be a lot of horrible stuff like that too, you know what I mean?
And that's crony capitalism. And that's why, like, in this example, Mark Zuckerberg, that hypothetical example to an extent, essentially he makes the barriers to entry for all these startups to enter and compete extremely difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think that's true.
It's bad, right?
Bad, yeah.
Because competition is good for the consumer, for sure, in the long run. Not always the short term, but the long term. Because think of something like LASIK eye surgery. LASIK eye surgery it's still expensive, right? But it's more affordable now than it was yesterday,
yeah.
or 20 years ago.
It was really expensive.
When it was really expensive, but the market eventually allowed for competition, better techniques, better medical equipment, and now a lot of people are getting it now today because it's more readily available. Just like cars were at one time very expensive, and now they're better, faster, last longer.
Cell phones,
they're all
but why? Because there's a lot of people have that framework, right? Because in this country we have the framework to compete through capitalism, and we have a lot of competition. When there's a lot of competition for a specific product or service, the prices start to come down because everyone's competing with each other versus a huge monopoly, right?
But you need assets. Going back to the whole thing we were talking about, property rights, assets. That's what all it is. Including real estate is important because they're like playing chips in this game. Even somebody like the creators of Atari, which was a little bit of entrepreneurial. What's it called? It's escaping. I can't believe I'm forgetting.
It's a game console, right? Atari.
Yeah,
I kind of forgot. It's like
there's another video on through that same organization about that I've used as well. It was about it's basically entrepreneurial capitalism. The idea that sometimes you have somebody with a lot of capital, you have somebody with wealth and assets, but they don't have a really good idea. But then you have somebody with a really good idea who doesn't have the other, right? So they band together, and they take a risk. They take a big risk. But in the end, sometimes you win, just like in Vegas. Sometimes you succeed really big, and other times you fail miserably. But ultimately, your risks, right? You have to on an individual level, you have to know what potentially could happen.
And it usually comes down to losing quite a bit, and then eventually you get your win. I think a lot of people that open up a business.
Sometimes you fail multiple times, and that's really it comes down to a lot of those things. Yeah.
So I appreciate your time today and breaking all that down for us, especially going all the way back to Thomas Hobbes and all these great philosophers that essentially influenced our country through Thomas Jefferson and set up those frameworks so we can have all these rights. And I think that's very important today, especially what's going on today as well. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm always ready to talk about stuff like this.
All right, cool. Well, maybe we'll do another video, hopefully, again. I appreciate your time, and we'll be talking soon.
All right. Peace.
All right. Thank you.